Hey guys, tonight we begin with silks, servitude, and systematic subordination. We're diving deep into the perfumed prisons of ancient Persia, where being chosen for the royal harem wasn't winning the lottery. It was entering a golden cage with invisible bars and consequences that lasted lifetimes. Forget the sultry dancers with flowing veils and mysterious smiles. Forget every Orientalist painting that made harem life look like an exotic vacation. Tonight we're exploring what it actually meant to be a concubine in the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. And spoiler alert, it wasn't about lounging on silk cushions eating grapes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So you're 12 years old, maybe 13 if you're unlucky enough to have developed early. You're living in some small village in the outer provinces of the Persian Empire, maybe in what we'd call modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, or even parts of Central Asia. Your family isn't poor exactly, but they're not wealthy either. Your father might be a craftsman, your mother weaves textiles, and you spend your days helping with household duties and playing with your younger siblings. Then one day, the Imperial Scouts arrive. Picture this: you're grinding grain in your family's courtyard, the stone pestle heavy in your small hands, when you hear the sound that makes every parent in the village freeze: horses. Not just any horses, but the synchronized clip-clop of trained war horses, carrying men who serve the King of Kings. The sound echoes off the mud brick walls of your neighborhood like a death knell, because everyone knows what this means. The satraps, the provincial governors, have sent their talent scouts, and they're not looking for administrative assistance. You peek around the corner of your house and see them. Men in flowing robes with perfectly oiled beards, their horses decorated with silver bells that announce their imperial authority. Behind them, a small caravan of covered wagons waits. You notice there are no other young women visible in your neighborhood anymore. Doors have been quietly shut, girls have been hidden in storage rooms and root cellars, and an unnatural silence has fallen over your usually bustling street. But hiding doesn't always work. Because these men aren't amateurs, they're professional beauty scouts for the most powerful man on earth, and they've been doing this for decades. They know every trick parents use to hide their daughters. They know to check the back rooms, the wells, the grain stores. They know to look for fresh footprints in the dirt, for still warm cooking fires that suggest recent occupancy, for the slight movement of curtains that indicates someone breathing behind them. Your mother tries to push you toward the storage room where your family keeps their winter grain, but it's too late. One of the scouts has already spotted you, and his trained eye immediately catalogues what he sees. Clear skin, no smallpox scars, a rarity, straight teeth, indicating good nutrition, symmetrical features, and that indefinable quality they call potential. You're not yet a woman, but they can see what you might become, and that's exactly what they're looking for. You, he says, pointing directly at you with a finger, decorated with rings that probably cost more than your family's house. Come here. There's no question in his voice, no request. It's a command backed by the authority of Cyrus the Great, or Darius, or whichever king happens to be sitting on the throne in Persepolis. Your parents might as well argue with a mountain or negotiate with the wind. The Persian Empire doesn't make suggestions, it gives orders. Your mother starts to weep, but quietly, because open grief in front of imperial representatives is considered disrespectful. Your father's jaw tightens, but he bows his head in submission. They both know that resisting won't save you, and will only bring punishment down on your entire family. Villages have been burned for less. The scout circles you like your livestock at market, which, in a very real sense, you are. He checks your teeth, not for dental hygiene, but to estimate your age and general health. He examines your hands for signs of disease or deformity. He has you walk back and forth so he can observe your gait and posture. He even smells your hair, checking for the particular scent of sickness that clings to people with certain ailments. Congratulations, you pass inspection. Within an hour, you're sitting in the back of a covered wagon with 17 other girls ranging in age from 11 to 15. Some are crying silently. Others stare ahead with the 1,000-yard stare of complete shock. A few try to comfort their younger companions. But what comfort can you offer when you're all headed to the same fate? The wagon smells like fierce sweat, and the straw they've thrown down to keep you from sliding around. There are no windows, just a small opening at the front where you can occasionally glimpse the driver's back. The wheels find every rock and pothole in the ancient roads, jarring your bones and making your teeth rattle. You're going to be travelling like this for weeks. And this is the comfortable part of your journey. Now that you're property of the Persian Empire, because let's call it what it is, you're no longer a person with rights, but an asset being transported to its designated location. You get to experience the hospitality of imperial logistics. And by hospitality, I mean you'll be treated exactly like any other valuable cargo, kept alive, minimally fed, and delivered in acceptable condition. The wagon bounces along the royal road, that marvel of ancient engineering that stretches from Sardis to Susa to Persepolis. Modern people complain about potholes, but you're experiencing what passes for a highway in 500 BCE. These roads were built for imperial messengers and military units, not comfort. Every stone embedded in the packed earth finds a way to bruise a new part of your body. Your spine feels like it's being systematically realigned by a particularly vindictive chiropractor. You're fed twice a day, morning and evening. The food is what they give to livestock, literally. Barley porridge in the morning, dried dates and flatbread in the evening, and water from whatever source is available. Sometimes that water tastes of minerals, sometimes of algae, and occasionally of things you prefer not to identify. There's no milk, no meat, no vegetables. You're getting enough calories to survive the journey, and that's the extent of the empire's nutritional concerns. Privacy? That's a concept as foreign as democracy. You relieve yourself when the caravan stops, which is approximately every 6 hours, in full view of anyone who happens to be looking. There's a designated area behind some rocks or bushes if you're lucky. But modesty is a luxury you can no longer afford. The other girls form human shields when possible, but the guards make it clear that lengthy stops are not appreciated. Speaking of the guards, these are professional soldiers whose job is to ensure valuable cargo reaches its destination intact. They're not cruel exactly, but they're also not your friends. They've done this route dozens of times, transporting everything from exotic animals to tribute gold to teenage girls destined for the royal harem. You're just another item on the manifest. The nights are when the real education begins. Because it's during these cold desert evenings, huddled together for warmth under scratchy woolen blankets, that the older girls start explaining what's actually going to happen to you. Miriam, who's 15 and was collected from a village 2 provinces over, becomes your unofficial instructor in the realities of harem life. She learnt about it from her older sister, who was selected 3 years earlier and never returned home. The information has been passed down like a particularly depressing oral tradition. First, she whispers in the darkness, her voice barely audible over the snoring of the guards. They'll test you for diseases, everything. They'll look in places you didn't know could be looked into. Then they'll teach you to read and write, if you can't already. Then comes the real education. The real education, she explains, involves learning to be decorative, compliant, and sexually available, while maintaining the elaborate fiction that you're honoured to be there. You'll learn to walk differently, speak differently, even breathe differently. You'll be taught to play musical instruments you've never seen, to dance in styles that would scandalise your village, and to present yourself as a work of art rather than a human being. But here's what Miriam's sister learned that no one tells you in advance. The harem isn't just about serving the king's pleasure. It's about surviving in a closed social system, where every other woman is simultaneously your sister and your rival, where the king might never notice you exist, and where growing old without bearing a royal child means spending your final decades as essentially a palace servant. The lucky ones, Miriam continues, get pregnant quickly and have sons. The unlucky ones spend 40 years waiting for a summons that never comes, and the really unlucky ones get noticed by the wrong people and disappear entirely. As you listen to this cheerful bedtime story, you're probably thinking that surely she's exaggerating. Surely the great king, ruler of an empire that stretches from India to Greece, has more important concerns than the intricate politics of his harem. Surely a system that's produced the greatest civilization in the known world must have some basic fairness built into it. Oh, you sweet summer child. You're about to learn that empires aren't built on fairness. They're built on the systematic exploitation of people exactly like you. After 3 weeks of what feels like being a ball in a cosmic pinball machine, you finally arrive at Persepolis, and your first glimpse of the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire is genuinely breathtaking, in the same way that seeing a tsunami approaching is breathtaking. It's magnificent, terrible, and completely overwhelming all at once. The scale is unlike anything you've ever imagined. The platform alone, the massive stone foundation upon which the entire complex sits, is larger than your entire village. The ceremonial stairways are wide enough for entire armies to march up in formation. The columns supporting the audience halls are taller than the biggest trees you've ever seen, carved with intricate reliefs showing the King of Kings receiving tribute from every corner of the known world. But you're not here for the tourist experience. Your wagon doesn't approach the main ceremonial areas where foreign ambassadors prostrate themselves before the peacock throne. Instead, you're taken around to what amounts to the service entrance, through a maze of administrative buildings, storage facilities, and living quarters that house the thousands of people required to keep an empire running. The women's quarters, your new permanent address, occupy an entire section of the complex, high walls topped with decorative metalwork that's beautiful from a distance, but clearly designed to keep people in rather than intruders out. Guards at every entrance, not for your protection, but to ensure you don't wander into areas where you're not welcome, which, as you'll learn, is essentially everywhere outside these walls. Your first stop is the processing center, which sounds bureaucratic but is actually more like a particularly thorough veterinary examination. You're stripped, bathed with harsh soap that smells like lye, and removes several layers of skin along with the dirt, and then examined by palace physicians who catalogue every mole, scar, and imperfection on your body. They're checking for diseases, yes, but they're also creating what amounts to an inventory list. You're now palace property, and like all valuable property, you need to be properly documented. The physician, an elderly man who performs this examination with the same emotional investment a carpenter might show while evaluating lumber pokes and prods while dictating notes to a scribe. Subject appears healthy. No visible skin diseases, teeth adequate, minor scar on left knee, probably childhood injury, estimated age 13 to 14 years, suitable for basic training program. Basic training program, as if you're joining the army rather than being inducted into sexual servitude. After the examination comes delousing, a process that involves having your head shaved completely bald and being doused with aromatic oils that burn your newly exposed scalp. Don't worry about your hair, they tell you. It will grow back, and when it does, it will be properly styled and maintained by palace hairdressers. Your natural appearance is now a thing of the past. Then comes your first introduction to harem hierarchy, which makes medieval feudalism look like a democratic commune. You're assigned to a dormitory with 12 other new arrivals, under the supervision of Roxana, a woman in her 20s who was once exactly where you are now. She's survived long enough to become what they call a senior student, which means she gets slightly better food, marginally more comfortable sleeping arrangements, and the privilege of training newcomers in the fine art of imperial submission. Roxana explains the rules while you're trying to adjust to your new sleeping mat, a thin layer of wool over stone that makes you nostalgic for the wagon. There are approximately 300 women in the harem at any given time, she tells you, ranging in age from recent arrivals like yourself to women in their 50s who've been here for decades. The hierarchy is rigid and unforgiving. At the top are the wives and mothers of royal children, followed by favoured concubines, then general concubines, then students, then servants. Your goal, she explains with the tone of someone who's repeated this speech countless times, is to move up this hierarchy. The alternative is moving down it, and trust me, you don't want to experience what happens at the bottom. What happens at the bottom, she explains without being asked, is that you become invisible. You perform menial labour, cooking, cleaning, laundry, for the women above you in the hierarchy. You get the worst food, the most uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, and absolutely no chance of ever attracting royal attention. Essentially, you become a slave serving slaves, with the added humiliation of knowing you were once considered beautiful enough to be here. But here's the cruel irony. Moving up the hierarchy requires attracting the attention of a man who might see you once a year if you're extraordinarily lucky. The King of Kings has an empire to run, wars to fight, and administrative complexities that would challenge a modern government. He doesn't have time to personally evaluate 300 women competing for his attention. Most of the time, he's not even in Persepolis. He's traveling to other capitals, inspecting military campaigns, or holding court in Susa or Babylon, so you're competing for the attention of someone who's essentially a rumour, a distant figure whose preferences you must somehow divine and cater to, despite having no direct access to information about what he actually likes. It's like trying to win a contest where you don't know the rules, can't see the judge, and the prize is survival. Welcome to your new life. Try to get some sleep on that stone mat. You'll need your energy for tomorrow's lessons in advanced powerlessness. Your real education begins at dawn, which arrives with all the gentleness of a cavalry charge. The palace operates on solar time, meaning you wake when the sun rises and sleep when it sets, regardless of season. In winter, you might get 9 hours of sleep. In summer, you're lucky to get 6. Your body's natural rhythms are now irrelevant. You run on imperial time. Breakfast is a bowl of barley porridge with honey, if you're fortunate, or dates if the honey stores are running low. It's served in a communal dining area where talking is discouraged and complaining is forbidden. You eat quickly because dawdling suggests ingratitude for imperial generosity, and ingratitude has consequences you prefer not to discover. Then comes your first formal lesson, deportment. And by deportment, I mean learning to move through the world as if you're a valuable vase rather than a human being. Your instructor is a woman named Astarte, who's been in the harem for 25 years and has perfected the art of graceful subjugation. She carries herself with the fluid elegance of water, never making an unnecessary movement, never displaying emotion, never suggesting that she has thoughts or opinions about anything more complex than the weather. Walk, she commands, and you walk. But not the way you've been walking your entire life, apparently. The natural human gait is unsuitable for palace life. Your steps are too long, your posture too relaxed, your arm movements too natural. Palace walking involves gliding rather than stepping, keeping your spine straight as if you're balancing a water jar on your head, and moving your arms in a way that suggests decorative rather than functional purposes. You practice walking for 2 hours, back and forth across a marble courtyard, while Astarte corrects every aspect of your movement. Shorter steps, straighter spine, softer arm swing. You're not ploughing a field, you're ornamenting a palace. By the end of the session, your back aches, your feet hurt, and you've developed a new appreciation for the simple pleasure of walking like a normal human being. But walking is just the beginning. Next comes sitting, which is apparently an art form you've been performing incorrectly your entire life. Palace sitting involves arranging your limbs in ways that emphasize gracefulness over comfort, keeping your back straight without appearing rigid, and maintaining an expression of serene contentment, regardless of how uncomfortable you actually are. Then comes speaking. Your natural voice, the one you've used to talk to your family, friends, and neighbors, is too loud, too direct, too assertive for palace life. Palace speaking involves lowering your voice to a melodious whisper, removing any regional accent that might identify your provincial origins, and eliminating words or phrases that suggest you have opinions about anything other than the king's magnificence. By midday, you've been systematically retrained in the most basic aspects of human existence. You can no longer walk, sit, or speak naturally. You're becoming a living doll, a decorative object designed to please a man you've never met, and probably never will. The afternoon brings cultural education, which sounds more promising until you realize it's not about expanding your mind, but about replacing your identity. You learn to play the santur, a stringed instrument that produces haunting melodies perfect for creating romantic atmosphere. You learn traditional Persian dances that emphasize fluid hip movements and graceful arm gestures. You learn to paint your eyes with kohl in the style favored by imperial fashion. But most importantly, you learn to read and write. This might seem like a genuine gift. Literacy was rare in the ancient world, especially for women, until you discover what you're expected to read. Palace literature consists entirely of poetry praising the king's wisdom, stories celebrating Persian military victories, and instructional texts explaining proper behavior for palace women. You're learning to read so that you can better understand your own subjugation. The writing lessons are even more pointed. You practice forming letters by copying phrases like, "The great king's wisdom surpasses the stars," and "I am honored to serve the light of Aryans," over and over until your hand cramps and the words become meaningless sounds. You're literally writing yourself into mental submission, training your brain to think in approved phrases and acceptable concepts. Evening brings the most psychologically destructive lesson of all: competition training. Because here's what no one tells you about harem life until you're already trapped in it. Every other woman here is your enemy, not by choice, but by design. The system only works if you're all fighting each other instead of recognizing your shared situation. Astarte explains this, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing the weather. Resources are limited. The king's attention is limited. Advancement opportunities are limited. Therefore, you must be better than every other woman here, smarter, more beautiful, more skilled, more pleasing. This is not friendship camp. This is survival. She has you practice subtle undermining techniques, how to compliment another woman in a way that highlights her flaws, how to position yourself favorably during group activities, how to make others look incompetent without appearing to try. You're being trained to smile while destroying each other, to maintain an appearance of sisterhood while engaging in psychological warfare. As you settle onto your sleeping mat that night, your head spinning with new rules and expectations, you realize something that makes your stomach clench with despair. You're being systematically erased. Your natural way of moving, speaking, and thinking is being replaced with an artificial persona designed to appeal to imperial tastes. In a few months, there will be nothing left of the village girl who ground grain in her family's courtyard. And tomorrow, the process continues. 3 months into your palace education, you're beginning to understand that the harem operates on a social system that makes high school cliques look like a model of egalitarian cooperation. Every woman here exists in a state of carefully calibrated desperation, where your position in the hierarchy determines everything from what you eat, to where you sleep, to whether you live or die. At the very top, like distant goddesses, are the queen mothers. Women who've produced male heirs and survived long enough to see their sons reach adulthood. These are the untouchables of harem society. Women whose power comes not from beauty, but from having successfully navigated the most dangerous game in the empire, royal reproduction. They dress in silk so fine it seems to shimmer with its own light, wear jewelry that could buy entire cities, and speak with the authority of women who know their position is secure. You've seen Queen Mother Cassandane exactly twice, always from a distance, always surrounded by an entourage of servants and younger wives seeking her favor. She moves through the harem like a visiting deity, acknowledging no one below her station, radiating the kind of power that comes from knowing the king values her opinion more than that of his generals. Her word can elevate a concubine to wife status, or condemn someone to the servant quarters, and everyone knows it. Below the queen mothers are the current wives, women who've managed to catch and hold royal attention long enough to receive formal recognition. There are usually 6 to 8 wives at any given time, though the number fluctuates based on imperial politics, personal preferences, and the occasional convenient death. These women live in apartments that would make provincial governors weep with envy, but they're still essentially prisoners whose comfort depends entirely on continued royal favour. Atossa, the current favourite wife, serves as your object lesson in the precarious nature of imperial approval. She's spectacularly beautiful, speaks 4 languages fluently, and can play 7 different musical instruments. But she's also 23 years old and hasn't produced a male heir in 3 years of marriage. You watch her during communal meals and see the carefully concealed terror in her eyes, the knowledge that her window of fertility is closing, and her value decreases with each month that passes without conception. Below the wives are the favoured concubines, women who've been summoned to the king's chambers, often enough to establish something resembling a relationship. Maybe a dozen women occupy this category at any given time, and their lives are studies in elegant anxiety. They dress almost as well as the wives, live in apartments almost as comfortable, and maintain almost as much dignity. But that almost contains worlds of difference. Shahzad has been a favoured concubine for 7 years. She's intelligent, educated, and genuinely witty. Qualities that initially attracted royal attention, but favour is finite, and 7 years is an eternity in harem time. She spends her days perfecting new skills, learning new languages, and desperately trying to reinvent herself in ways that might recapture imperial interest. You watch her practice dance moves that would challenge a professional athlete, memorize poetry and languages she'll probably never speak with anyone else, and apply cosmetics with the precision of a master artist, all in preparation for summons that come less and less frequently. Then there are the general concubines, the largest group in the harem, comprising women who've been summoned to royal chambers occasionally, but haven't established regular relationships. This is where most women spend most of their harem careers, in a state of perpetual audition, constantly preparing for opportunities that may never come. The competition among general concubines is particularly vicious because there's so little to distinguish between you. You're all young, you're all beautiful by the standards of your time. You've all received the same basic training in palace etiquette and entertainment skills. So the differences that matter become increasingly arbitrary and psychological. Who has the longest hair? Who learned the newest dance first? Who laughed at the right moment during the last group entertainment session? You discover this when Gulshan, a girl from the eastern provinces who arrived 2 weeks after you, begins what can only be described as a campaign of subtle sabotage, nothing overt, that would bring punishment from the supervisors. Instead, she begins a series of small actions designed to make you look incompetent or undesirable. She accidentally spills henna on your practice dress the night before inspection. She asks innocent questions about your family background that happen to highlight your humble provincial origins. She practices her musical instruments during the hours when you're supposed to be sleeping, ensuring you're always slightly tired during lessons. This isn't personal animosity, it's rational self-interest within an irrational system. Gulshan understands that in a competition where only a few can win, making others lose is a legitimate strategy, and she's absolutely right. In a system designed to pit women against each other, cooperation is luxury that can literally cost you your life. Below the general concubines are the students, your current category. And below the students are the servants. The servants are women who've aged out of consideration for royal attention, but are still useful for manual labour. They're the harem's invisible workforce. Cleaning, cooking, maintaining the elaborate infrastructure that keeps 300 women fed, clothed, and entertained. They're also your glimpse into the future if you fail to advance up the hierarchy. Daria has been a servant for 15 years. She arrived as a 13-year-old beauty from a wealthy merchant family, spent a decade as a general concubine who was never summoned, and gradually transitioned into invisibility. Now she scrubs floors, empties chamber pots, and maintains the complex plumbing systems that supply the harem's baths. She's 43 years old, which is ancient by harem standards, and she speaks to no one above her station, unless directly addressed. But here's what makes the hierarchy particularly cruel. It's not static. Women move up and down based on factors largely beyond their control. A concubine who bears a son immediately jumps several levels. A wife who falls from favour can find herself demoted to general concubine status. A servant who catches royal attention during a chance encounter, unlikely but not impossible, might suddenly find herself elevated to student status. This mobility is supposed to provide hope, but it actually makes the system more psychologically devastating. If your position were fixed, you could eventually accept your fate and find peace within your limitations. But the possibility of change keeps everyone in a constant state of desperate aspiration and paranoid terror. You can never relax, never stop competing, never trust anyone completely. As you lie on your sleeping mat, listening to the whispered conversations of women planning tomorrow's campaigns for advancement, you realize you're living in a social system designed by someone with a truly sophisticated understanding of human psychology. Every aspect of harem life is calculated to keep you simultaneously hopeful and desperate, competitive and isolated, grateful and terrified. And you're beginning to understand that this isn't an accident. It's exactly how the system is supposed to work. 6 months into your harem education, you learn one of the most important lessons for survival in the Persian imperial system. You are always being watched, but the watchers are as trapped as you are. Every conversation you have is monitored, every gesture is evaluated, every expression that crosses your face is noted and interpreted by someone whose job depends on understanding the shifting dynamics of harem politics. But here's what makes the surveillance particularly insidious. It's not conducted by distant imperial agents, but by the women around you, who've been turned into unwilling spies through a system of rewards and punishments that makes cooperation impossible. Take Yasmin, for instance. She's a general concubine who's been in the harem for 8 years without receiving a single royal summons. Her beauty has faded from spectacular to merely above average. Her skills are competent but not exceptional, and she's approaching the age where imperial attention becomes increasingly unlikely. Under normal circumstances, she'd be facing gradual demotion to servant status and a future of invisible manual labor. But Yasmin has discovered a way to maintain her position: intelligence gathering. She's become an unofficial informant for the palace administrators, reporting on conversations that suggest disloyalty, relationships that might threaten harem stability, and behavioral patterns that indicate potential problems. In exchange, she receives slightly better food, marginally more comfortable accommodations, and the promise that her inevitable decline will be gradual rather than precipitous. This means every casual conversation you have with Yasmin is actually an interrogation session disguised as friendly chat. She asks about your dreams with the apparent sympathy of an older sister, but she's really determining whether you harbor unrealistic expectations that might make you difficult to manage. She inquires about your family with seeming curiosity, but she's actually assessing whether you have external loyalties that might compete with palace devotion. She comments on other women's behavior with apparent casualness, but she's testing whether you'll engage in gossip that can be reported to the administrators. The genius of the system is that everyone knows this is happening, but no one can openly acknowledge it without risking punishment. Accusing someone of being an informant without proof is considered disruptive behavior. Refusing to engage in social conversation is interpreted as sullenness or potential rebellion. You're forced to participate in a social dynamic where genuine connection is impossible, but the appearance of friendship is mandatory. And it gets worse, because the surveillance system creates layers of paranoia that extend beyond simple information gathering. You begin to monitor your own thoughts, censoring not just what you say, but what you think, because thinking forbidden thoughts might somehow show on your face and be detected by one of the watchers. You learn this lesson during a poetry recitation session led by Mandane, one of the palace's cultural instructors. She's teaching you classical Persian verses that celebrate the empire's glory and the king's divine wisdom. The poetry is actually quite beautiful, complex metaphors about light conquering darkness, sophisticated wordplay that demonstrates genuine literary skill, vivid imagery that makes abstract concepts concrete and memorable. But as you're memorizing a particularly elaborate metaphor comparing the king to the sun bringing life to the earth, you have a moment of mental rebellion. You think about how the sun also brings drought, burns crops if it shines too intensely, and actually makes life impossible if you're forced to stare directly into it. It's just a fleeting thought, barely a second of mental resistance, but somehow Mandane notices. "Lovely," she says, interrupting the recitation. "You seem distracted today. Perhaps you'd like to share what's capturing your attention." The question is posed with sweet concern, but everyone in the room understands it's actually a test. Are you going to admit to having inappropriate thoughts about imperial metaphors? Are you going to lie, which is also punishable? Are you going to try to deflect, which suggests you have something to hide? You mumble something about being tired from yesterday's dance practice, which is weak but not technically disloyal. Mandane smiles and continues the lesson, but you notice she pays particularly close attention to you for the rest of the session. And that evening, she has a long, quiet conversation with Roxana, your dormitory supervisor. The next morning, you're assigned to additional deportment training with Astarte, which is supposedly a privilege, but actually feels like punishment. You suspect your moment of mental rebellion somehow showed on your face, was detected by Mandane, and has now been entered into whatever records the palace keeps about your psychological development. But here's what makes the surveillance truly diabolical. You start doing it yourself. You begin watching other women for signs of disloyalty, not because you want to inform on them, but because understanding the surveillance network becomes necessary for navigating it. You learn to recognize the signs that someone is about to be called in for additional guidance with the administrators. You develop an instinct for identifying the informal informants among your fellow students, and gradually, you realize you're becoming part of the system that's oppressing you. You're watching others the way others watch you, interpreting their words and expressions through the lens of palace politics, mentally cataloguing information that could be useful if you ever need to deflect attention from your own behavior. The worst part is that some of this surveillance is genuinely protective. When 15-year-old Bahar starts showing signs of what modern psychology would recognize as clinical depression, loss of appetite, inability to sleep, complete withdrawal from social interaction, it's Yasmin who reports her behavior to the administrators, not out of cruelty, but because untreated depression in the harem often leads to suicide attempts, and suicide attempts result in collective punishments for everyone in the affected dormitory. So Bahar gets transferred to what's euphemistically called individual attention, closer supervision, modified duties, and regular sessions with palace physicians who understand mental distress but treat it as a management problem rather than a human condition requiring compassion. She survives, technically, but she also disappears from your social circle in a way that makes it clear her future in the harem has been fundamentally altered. As you drift off to sleep each night, you find yourself mentally reviewing every conversation you had that day, analysing your own words and expressions for anything that might be interpreted as problematic. You're becoming your own surveillance system, monitoring yourself with the same paranoid attention that others monitor you. And this, you realise, is exactly how totalitarian systems work. They don't just control your behaviour, they teach you to control yourself, to internalise the surveillance until external monitoring becomes unnecessary. You become both prisoner and guard, victim and enforcer, the watched and the watcher. 1 year into your harem residency, you understand that beauty in the Persian Empire isn't a natural attribute, it's an industrial process requiring constant maintenance, significant financial investment, and the labour of dozens of specialised workers whose sole purpose is transforming human beings into decorative objects. Your daily beauty routine begins before dawn and doesn't end until you're finally released to sleep. It's a complex operation involving more chemicals, tools, and techniques than most modern spa treatments, all designed to create an appearance that signals your value as imperial property, while simultaneously emphasizing your complete dependence on palace resources. The process starts with your hair, which has grown back from the initial delousing, but now requires daily attention from palace hairdressers, who've elevated follicle management to an art form. These women, former concubines who've aged out of consideration but retained employment through specialized skills, spend 2 hours each morning creating elaborate arrangements that defy both gravity and logic. First comes the washing, which involves soaps made from olive oil, ash, and aromatic herbs that cost more per ounce than most people earn in a month. Your scalp is massaged with oils imported from India, treated with conditioning mixtures containing egg whites and honey, and rinsed with water that's been infused with rose petals and filtered through silk cloths. Then comes the styling, which transforms your hair into architectural achievements that require engineering skills to maintain. Braids within braids, curls arranged in precise spirals, sections twisted into knots that somehow stay in place despite physics. The hairdressers use tools that look like torture devices, heated metal rods for creating curls, sharp pins for holding arrangements in place, and combs made from ivory that's been carved with such precision they function like precision instruments. The final step involves decoration. Strings of pearls woven through the braids, gold threads twisted around the curls, and tiny bells that create musical accompaniment to your movements. By the time they're finished, your head carries approximately 3 pounds of additional weight in the form of decorative elements, and you've learnt to move carefully to avoid disturbing arrangements that took 2 hours to create and can be destroyed by a single careless gesture. Your face receives equal attention from cosmetic specialists, who treat makeup application like military strategy. They begin with a base layer of white lead powder mixed with ground pearls, a combination that creates the pale complexion favoured by imperial fashion, but also slowly poisons anyone who uses it regularly. The powder is applied with brushes made from the finest animal hair, blended until your natural skin tone completely disappears beneath artificial pallor. Then comes the artistry. Kohl around your eyes, applied in patterns that make them appear larger and more mysterious. Rouge made from crushed insects mixed with plant dyes to create the perfect shade of lip colour, and henna used to paint intricate designs on your hands and arms. The process requires such precision that a single mistake means removing everything and starting over, which has happened to you more times than you care to remember. Your eyebrows are plucked into shapes that complement your bone structure. Your eyelashes are darkened with a mixture of soot and oil, and your fingernails are painted with lacquers that require multiple coats and hours of drying time. By the time the cosmetic specialists finish with you, you look like a work of art. Beautiful, certainly, but also fundamentally artificial, like a painting of a person rather than an actual human being. The clothing situation is equally elaborate and expensive. Your daily outfit consists of layers upon layers of silk, each dyed with pigments that cost more than most people's annual income. The undergarments alone, thin silk shifts designed to create smooth lines beneath the outer garments, cost enough to buy a small farm. The outer robes are masterpieces of textile engineering, hand-woven fabrics decorated with embroidered patterns that tell stories, incorporate precious metals, and demonstrate the wealth and power of their owner. But here's what makes the whole system particularly perverse. None of this luxury actually belongs to you. You're essentially a living mannequin displaying the palace's wealth and artistic capabilities. The clothes, jewelry, and cosmetics are all palace property, assigned to you based on your current status in the hierarchy, and subject to immediate confiscation if your position changes. You learn this lesson when Roxana, a general concubine who's held steady middle-tier status for 3 years, makes the mistake of expressing mild criticism about palace food during a casual conversation with other women. Nothing treasonous, just a comment that the evening meal was under-seasoned and could have benefited from more saffron. But criticism of palace provisions is interpreted as ingratitude for imperial generosity, and ingratitude is interpreted as potential disloyalty. Within a week, Roxana finds herself reassigned to a lower-tier dormitory with different clothing allowances. The silk robes she's worn for months are confiscated and replaced with simpler garments made from lesser fabrics. Her jewelry allowance is reduced, her cosmetics rations are cut, and her hairdressing appointments are shortened. She goes from looking like a princess to looking like a well-dressed servant, and the change is dramatic enough that everyone notices and understands the message. The message is that your beauty, your primary source of value in this system, isn't actually yours. It's an imperial loan that can be revoked at any time, for any reason, without warning or appeal. You're not beautiful, you're temporarily decorated with beautiful things that can be taken away the moment you displease someone with the authority to make that decision. This creates a psychological dynamic that's particularly devastating because it makes you complicit in your own objectification. You find yourself genuinely caring about the quality of your cosmetics, anxiously monitoring the condition of your clothing, and feeling pride in your appearance even though you rationally understand that none of it represents your authentic self. You start to panic when a hairdresser mentions that your hair texture might not be ideal for the most elaborate styling options. You feel genuine distress when a cosmetic specialist suggests that your skin tone would benefit from different powder mixtures. You worry constantly about maintaining the physical standards necessary to keep your current decoration allowances, because you've learnt that losing access to beauty resources is functionally equivalent to becoming invisible. And slowly, insidiously, you begin to internalize the palace's assessment of your value. On days when your appearance is particularly successful, when the hairdressers achieve an especially elegant arrangement, when the cosmetics create a particularly stunning effect, when your clothing fits with exceptional grace, you feel genuinely good about yourself. Not because you've accomplished anything meaningful, but because you've successfully displayed imperial wealth in an aesthetically pleasing manner. On days when your appearance is less successful, when your hair won't hold its style, when the cosmetics don't blend properly, when your clothing seems ill-fitting, you feel genuinely depressed and worthless. Again, not because of any personal failure, but because you failed to meet standards that were designed to reduce you to a decorative object. The most insidious part is that this isn't happening just to you. It's happening to every woman in the harem, creating a community of people who've been systematically trained to derive their self-worth from their effectiveness as luxury goods. You're all competing to be the most successful ornaments, the most appealing decorative objects, the most convincing illusions of voluntary participation in your own commodification. And the really twisted part, some days you actually win these competitions. Some days you achieve a level of artificial beauty that draws genuine admiration from other women, approval from supervisors, and subtle signs of recognition from palace officials. Those victories feel real, even though you know they're meaningless. They provide genuine satisfaction, even though you understand they're based on completely hollow criteria. You're being trained to love your own oppression, to take pride in your own objectification, to compete enthusiastically for the privilege of being more successfully exploited than the women around you. And the training is working. As you examine your artificially pale, artistically decorated, expensively dressed reflection in the polished metal mirrors provided for your morning inspections, you realize you're looking at a stranger, someone who shares your basic bone structure, but has been transformed into something that bears no resemblance to the village girl who once ground grain in her family's courtyard. And the most terrifying part is that you're starting to prefer this version of yourself. 18 months into your harem residency, you've mastered the most crucial skill for imperial survival, the art of productive waiting. Because here's what no one tells you about being a concubine in the greatest empire on earth. 95% of your time is spent preparing for interactions that will probably never happen with a man you may never meet. Your days have settled into a routine that would make a monastery seem spontaneous. Morning beautification, 2 hours. Educational sessions, 3 hours. Afternoon cultural refinement, 2 hours. Evening social time, 1 hour. Sleeping, 8 hours if you're lucky, 6 if the palace is hosting entertainment events that require your decorative presence. But within this structure, every single moment is oriented toward a theoretical future, summons to royal chambers. You're not learning to play the santur because music is inherently valuable. You're learning it because the king might someday request musical entertainment and choose you to provide it. You're not studying Persian poetry because literature enriches the soul. You're memorizing verses you might be asked to recite if you ever find yourself in imperial presence. The psychological effect of this constant preparation without actual application is remarkably similar to what modern people experience during long-term unemployment, except with significantly higher stakes and no possibility of changing careers. You maintain a state of perpetual readiness for opportunities that may never materialize, while simultaneously watching other people receive the chances you're also waiting for. Take your current dormitory situation. You're sharing sleeping quarters with 11 other women, all of whom arrived within 6 months of each other and have received essentially identical training. You're like a dozen versions of the same product sitting on a shelf, each slightly different but functionally equivalent, waiting for a customer who might not even visit the store. Persia, who sleeps on the mat next to yours, has become the group's unofficial mood barometer. She arrived 2 months before you from a merchant family in Babylon, speaks 3 languages fluently, and has mastered every musical instrument the palace teaches. By any reasonable measure, she's exceptionally qualified for whatever role concubines are supposed to fulfill. But qualified is meaningless in a system where selection criteria are arbitrary and opportunities are distributed based on imperial whim rather than merit. Every morning, Persia wakes up with the same carefully controlled optimism, applies her cosmetics with the same meticulous attention to detail, and performs her daily duties with the same dedication to excellence. Every evening she goes to sleep, having received no summons, no recognition, no indication that anyone with decision-making authority is even aware she exists. She's been doing this for 20 months. But here's what makes the waiting particularly cruel. It's not static. Just enough women receive royal attention to keep hope alive for everyone else. Maybe once every 2 months, someone from your general status level gets summoned to royal chambers. Not necessarily for sexual purposes. Sometimes the king wants musical entertainment. Sometimes he needs someone to read to him while he reviews administrative documents. Sometimes he just wants decorative company during meals. These summons are announced with great ceremony by palace officials who understand the psychological impact of their pronouncements. The selected woman is congratulated by supervisors, envied by her peers, and immediately elevated in status regardless of what actually happens during her royal encounter. She moves to better accommodations, receives improved clothing allowances, and gains access to social privileges that demonstrate her advancement in the hierarchy. Last month, Gulshan, remember her, the girl who'd been sabotaging your early training, received her first royal summons. The announcement came during the evening meal, delivered by a palace official who might as well have been announcing lottery results. Gulshan, daughter of Artaxerxes, is commanded to attend his magnificence tomorrow evening for musical entertainment. The response was immediate and illuminating. Every woman in the dining hall turned to look at Gulshan with expressions that ranged from genuine happiness through barely concealed envy to calculating assessment of what this might mean for their own prospects. Gulshan herself went pale, then flushed, then began trembling so violently she couldn't finish her meal. Being chosen was simultaneously the best and most terrifying thing that could happen to her. The next evening, she was bathed, dressed, and decorated by the palace's most skilled specialists. Her hair was arranged in a style reserved for women granted royal audience. Her cosmetics were applied using the finest pigments available. Her clothing was selected from garments normally assigned to higher status concubines. She looked absolutely magnificent, like a goddess prepared for divine consultation. She returned to the dormitory at midnight, officially elevated to recognized concubine status, but emotionally devastated in ways that took weeks to understand. Because royal attention, it turns out, is not necessarily pleasant attention. The king had indeed requested musical entertainment, but he'd spent the entire evening conducting administrative business while she played. She might as well have been a piece of furniture with musical capabilities. He never looked at her directly, never spoke to her personally, never acknowledged her presence beyond the initial command to begin playing. But she'd been in royal chambers. She'd breathed the same air as the King of Kings. She'd seen the legendary golden throne, the jeweled walls, the exotic animals that served as living decorations, and most importantly, she'd been selected. Out of hundreds of qualified candidates, imperial attention had fallen on her. The experience destroyed something fundamental in Gulshan's personality. She'd spent 2 years fantasizing about royal summons, imagining conversations with the king, dreaming about the moment when her beauty and skills would finally receive recognition from the most powerful man on earth. The reality, being treated as animated background music, was so far from her expectations that she struggled to process what had actually happened. She began speaking differently, moving differently, relating to other women differently, not because her circumstances had improved dramatically, but because she'd crossed a psychological threshold that separated women who'd been summoned from women who were still waiting. She'd been chosen, even if being chosen meant discovering that royal attention was nothing like what she'd imagined. And watching her transformation taught everyone else a lesson that made the waiting even more psychologically complex. Getting what you thought you wanted might be worse than not getting it at all. But that knowledge didn't stop anyone from wanting it. Because the alternative to waiting hopefully is accepting that you'll spend the rest of your life in gradual decline, watching your beauty fade and your status deteriorate until you join the invisible women who clean the chambers where younger versions of yourself continue their own futile preparations. And that alternative is psychologically unacceptable, even when the waiting itself becomes a form of slow torture. So you continue preparing. You practice your musical instruments with the dedication of a professional performer, getting ready for the concert of her lifetime. You memorize poetry with the intensity of a scholar, preparing for the most important examination in history. You perfect your cosmetic application with the precision of an artist, creating a masterpiece that might be seen by the one person whose opinion could change your entire future. All for interactions that probably won't happen with someone who might not care, even if they do. As you lie on your sleeping mat, listening to the whispered conversations of women, analysing every rumour about royal preferences, every hint about imperial scheduling, every fragment of information that might provide insight into how selection decisions are made, you realise you're participating in the world's most elaborate confidence game. Everyone knows the odds are terrible. Everyone understands that most women will wait their entire lives without receiving significant royal attention. Everyone recognises that even successful summons often provide no real benefit beyond temporary status elevation. But everyone continues playing because the alternative is admitting that you've already lost a game you never chose to play. 2 years into your harem residency, you witness your first pregnancy scandal, and it teaches you more about imperial politics than all your formal education combined. Because in the Persian royal harem, getting pregnant isn't a biological process, it's a political event with consequences that ripple through the entire imperial system. It starts with Statara, a general concubine, who's been summoned to royal chambers exactly 4 times in 3 years. Not frequently enough to be considered a favourite, but often enough to maintain hope and status above the completely ignored masses. She's intelligent, genuinely funny when she forgets to monitor herself, and has that quality of natural grace that can't be taught through deportment lessons. The pregnancy announcement comes during the morning meal, delivered with the ceremonial gravity reserved for matters of dynastic importance. Palace physicians have confirmed that Statira is carrying what might be a future prince of the Persian Empire. Congratulations are offered, prayers are recited, and Statira is immediately transferred from the general dormitory to individual quarters befitting her new status as a vessel for imperial bloodline continuation. But here's what you quickly learn about royal pregnancies. They're not private medical matters, they're public entertainment for a community of women who've been systematically denied any other form of meaningful activity. Statira's pregnancy becomes the center of an obsessive collective focus that reveals just how psychologically starved everyone has become. Every aspect of her condition is analyzed with the intensity, usually reserved for military intelligence. How many times did she vomit this morning? What did she eat for breakfast? How many hours did she sleep? What was her mood during afternoon lessons? The information is gathered, shared, interpreted, and reinterpreted as if understanding the details of her pregnancy might provide insight into the mysterious process of achieving royal favor. More importantly, her pregnancy triggers a recalculation of everyone else's position in the harem hierarchy. Because if Statira gives birth to a son, she immediately jumps to the top of the social system, bypassing women who've been cultivating their positions for decades. And if she gives birth to a daughter, she still advances significantly, but remains accessible to challenge from other pregnant women. This creates a dynamic where pregnancy becomes simultaneously the most desired and most feared outcome of royal attention. Desired because it's the only reliable path to long-term security in the harem. Feared because the competition for reproductive success transforms every other pregnant woman into a potential enemy whose successful childbirth diminishes your own chances for advancement. The psychological pressure on Statira becomes immediately apparent. She's moved to quarters that are more comfortable, but also more isolated, effectively removing her from the social support systems that make harem life bearable. She's assigned personal servants who monitor her every movement under the pretense of ensuring her health, but actually function as surveillance systems reporting to palace administrators. She's given the best food, the finest medical care, and complete freedom from physical labor, but she's also lost any semblance of privacy or autonomy. Worse, she becomes a lightning rod for the accumulated resentments of women who've been waiting years for the opportunity she's apparently achieved through random chance. The congratulations offered in public are genuine, but the private conversations reveal a complex mixture of envy, hope, and barely concealed hostility. Women who were her friends last month begin analyzing her behavior for signs of arrogance or ingratitude. Women who barely knew her suddenly become intensely interested in her background, her family history, her previous interactions with the king. The most disturbing dynamic involves the older women, former concubines and wives, who've already passed their prime reproductive years and are watching a younger woman achieve the security they never attained. Their responses range from maternal protectiveness to bitter resentment, often shifting between extremes based on Statira's daily behavior. If she seems appropriately humble and grateful, she receives advice and support. If she appears to be enjoying her elevated status, she faces subtle social punishments that make her isolation even more complete. But the real education in harem politics comes when another pregnancy is announced 6 weeks later. Artie Stone, a favoured concubine who's been summoned regularly for 2 years, is also expecting. Suddenly, Statira's pregnancy is no longer unique, and the dynamics shift from collective fascination to active competition. Now there are 2 women carrying potential heirs, which means 2 women competing for the maternal privileges that come with successful reproduction. The palace physicians who monitor their health become arbiters of relative status, determining whose pregnancy is progressing better, whose child might be born first, whose condition requires more attention and resources. Every medical examination becomes a competitive evaluation with social consequences. The competition extends beyond the pregnant women themselves to their informal support networks. Women align themselves with one pregnancy or the other, not out of personal loyalty, but as strategic investments in potential future power structures. If Statira gives birth to a son who survives to adulthood, the women who supported her during pregnancy might benefit from her gratitude and influence. If Artie Stone's child proves more advantageous, being on her side during the pregnancy provides better long-term prospects. You find yourself drawn into this dynamic, despite recognizing its absurdity. When Statira mentions feeling nauseated during morning lessons, you offer sympathetic comments that are duly noted by other women as evidence of your political allegiances. When Artie Stone requests help reaching a high shelf in the library, your assistance is interpreted as a declaration of support for her pregnancy over Statira's. The whole situation becomes even more complex when palace officials begin making subtle inquiries about the paternity timeline. Not directly, of course. Questioning royal paternity would be treasonous, but careful questions about exactly when each woman was summoned, combined with precise monitoring of pregnancy development, allow administrators to calculate whether both children could plausibly be royal offspring, or whether one pregnancy might result from some other encounter. This introduces an element of terror into what should be joyful experiences. Both women know that any suggestion of uncertain paternity could result in execution, but they also know that palace officials are actively looking for discrepancies that might indicate problems. They're forced to present their pregnancies as unquestionably royal, while simultaneously competing with each other for recognition as the more legitimate or valuable imperial vessel. The psychological toll becomes apparent when Statira begins experiencing what modern medicine would recognize as severe prenatal anxiety. She stops eating properly, sleeps poorly, and becomes increasingly withdrawn from social interaction. But expressing anxiety about pregnancy outcomes is interpreted as ingratitude for imperial blessing, so she's forced to maintain an appearance of serene contentment while privately struggling with fears that could literally kill her if discovered. Artie Stone responds differently, becoming almost aggressively cheerful and social, as if compensating for Statira's withdrawal by demonstrating her own psychological fitness for motherhood. But her forced optimism is equally disturbing, suggesting that she's equally terrified, but channeling her fear into performative enthusiasm rather than visible withdrawal. As you watch these two women navigate pregnancy within a system designed to maximize their stress, while demanding expressions of gratitude for the experience, you realize you're witnessing a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The palace has taken the most fundamental human experience, creating new life, and transformed it into a competition that destroys the very women it's supposed to reward. And somehow, despite seeing this entire dynamic play out in front of you, you still find yourself hoping that someday you'll be the one facing these impossible pressures. Because even pregnancy-induced psychological torture looks better than spending your entire life waiting for something that never comes. 3 years into your harem education, you've developed fluency in the most complex language ever devised, the elaborate system of verbal and non-verbal communication that allows powerless people to express forbidden thoughts without technically violating the rules that govern their existence. This linguistic evolution is necessary for survival because direct communication is impossible in a system where honesty about your circumstances is interpreted as ingratitude, criticism of your situation is treated as disloyalty, and expressing your actual feelings can result in punishments that make your current situation seem pleasant by comparison. So you learn to speak in code, to communicate through implications, to express dangerous ideas through carefully constructed indirection that provides plausible deniability if your words are ever examined by authority figures looking for evidence of subversive thinking. Take the simple question of how you're feeling on any given day. In normal human conversation, you might say, "I'm tired," or "I'm frustrated," or "I'm worried about my future." But in palace language, expressing fatigue suggests you're not grateful for the opportunity to serve imperial purposes. Admitting frustration implies criticism of the perfect system that provides for your every need. Acknowledging worry about your future indicates lack of faith in imperial wisdom and planning. Instead, you learn to say things like, "I'm reflecting on the generosity of His magnificence," when you mean you're depressed. Or "I'm overwhelmed by the beauty of palace life," when you mean you're having an anxiety attack. Or "I'm contemplating the wisdom of imperial traditions," when you mean you're questioning everything about your situation but can't say so directly. The other women understand this linguistic code because they've all learnt the same survival techniques. When Artie Stone says she's adjusting to the blessings of her new circumstances after her pregnancy announcement, everyone knows she means she's terrified about the political implications of carrying a potentially royal child. When Gulshan mentions being inspired by the artistic traditions of the palace during cosmetics training, it's understood that she's having another breakdown about the meaninglessness of spending 4 hours each day on artificial beauty routines. But the coded language goes beyond simple emotional expression to encompass complex political communication that would be impossible through direct speech. Information about palace politics, warnings about dangerous people, advice about navigating social hierarchies, all of this must be transmitted through conversations that sound innocuous to casual listeners but carry multiple layers of meaning for people trained to decode them. You master this skill during a conversation with Mandane, your poetry instructor, who's been teaching classical Persian literature for 15 years and has developed the coded communication system into an art form that rivals the verses she's supposed to be teaching. The ancient poets, she says during a lesson on metaphorical language, understood that the most profound truths often require indirect expression. When Ferdowsi writes about the sun's relationship to the earth, he's exploring themes that extend far beyond astronomy. On the surface, this is a standard academic observation about literary symbolism, but Mandane's tone and emphasis suggest she's actually providing commentary on imperial power structures. The sun represents royal authority, the earth represents subjects like yourselves, and the relationship involves dynamics of dependency, control, and potential destruction that can't be discussed directly. Of course, she continues, the earth receives life from the sun, but too much solar attention can create deserts. The most fertile lands enjoy moderate exposure, enough to thrive, not so much that they burn. This is a masterclass in coded political advice. She's telling you that receiving royal attention is beneficial up to a point, but excessive imperial focus can be as dangerous as being ignored. Women who attract too much royal interest often find themselves subjected to pressures that destroy them as surely as complete neglect. The wisest earthly elements, she concludes, learn to flourish in whatever light they receive, while maintaining the internal resources necessary for survival during darker periods. Translation: develop your own psychological and social survival systems rather than depending entirely on imperial favor, because imperial favor is unreliable and imperial disfavor can be fatal. The entire lesson takes place within the framework of legitimate literary instruction, but every woman in the room understands they've just received advanced training in harem politics, and Mandane has provided this guidance without saying anything that could be interpreted as criticism of imperial policies or encouragement of disloyal thinking. You begin to recognize this coded communication everywhere once you understand how to listen for it. When Roxana, your dormitory supervisor, reminds everyone about the importance of supporting each other's artistic development, she's actually warning about the dangers of competitive sabotage that could bring negative attention to your entire group. When palace physicians ask about your satisfaction with your educational opportunities, they're probing for signs of depression or rebellion that might require intervention. Even the entertainment sessions become opportunities for coded political expression. During musical performances, the selection of songs communicates information about current palace dynamics. Melancholy pieces suggest that someone important is experiencing difficulties. Triumphant compositions indicate that recent political developments have favored the harem's interests. Complex instrumental arrangements that require multiple performers to coordinate their efforts serve as practice for the kind of social cooperation necessary for surviving in competitive environments. The dance sessions are particularly rich with coded meaning. Traditional Persian dances include movements that can be performed with subtle variations to convey different emotional messages. A gesture that appears celebratory to casual observers might actually express resignation or defiance, depending on the precise angle of the arm movement or the duration of a particular pose. Women who've mastered these variations can have entire conversations through choreography while appearing to simply practice their performance skills. But the most sophisticated coded communication involves the group discussions about palace policies and imperial decisions. These conversations must maintain complete loyalty to official positions while somehow allowing participants to express their actual thoughts about policies that directly affect their lives. When new regulations are announced, changes to visiting privileges, modifications to dietary restrictions, adjustments to social hierarchies, the official response is always enthusiastic gratitude for imperial wisdom. But within this framework of mandatory appreciation, women find ways to communicate their real opinions through emphasis, timing, and carefully chosen supporting details. His Magnificence's decision to modify our interaction schedules, someone might say, demonstrates his profound understanding of our community's complex social needs. The statement is perfectly loyal, but the word complex suggests that the speaker recognizes complications that weren't addressed by the policy change. The phrase social needs implies that there are needs beyond the social ones that also remain unmet. Other women respond with equally coded observations that build on these implications without ever directly contradicting official positions. Yes, the wisdom of addressing scheduling concerns shows remarkable attention to details that less insightful rulers might overlook. This sounds like praise, but it actually suggests that the policy change addressed relatively minor issues while ignoring more significant problems. The conversation continues in this manner, allowing participants to engage in substantive political discussion while maintaining the appearance of loyal approval. To anyone monitoring the discussion for signs of disloyalty, the conversation appears to demonstrate appropriate gratitude and proper understanding of imperial benevolence. To the participants, it provides an opportunity for genuine intellectual engagement with policies that affect their daily lives. Learning this coded language becomes essential, not just for expressing forbidden thoughts, but for maintaining your sanity in a system designed to isolate you from authentic human connection. The ability to communicate real ideas, even indirectly, helps preserve the parts of your personality that would otherwise be erased by the constant pressure to perform gratitude for your own subjugation. But mastering coded communication also makes you complicit in maintaining the system that requires it. By becoming skilled at expressing dissent through loyal-sounding language, you help preserve the appearance of universal satisfaction that imperial authority requires. You become simultaneously a victim of the system and a participant in the mechanisms that make the system possible. As you drift off to sleep, mentally composing tomorrow's coded communications about your gratitude for educational opportunities and your appreciation for the wisdom of palace policies, you realize you've learnt to be fluent in a language that allows you to speak while saying nothing, to communicate while remaining silent, to express yourself while erasing yourself, and you're becoming very, very good at it. 4 years into your harem residency, you've learnt to recognize the subtle signs that indicate when the King of Kings is planning to visit the women's quarters for entertainment and relaxation. The entire palace shifts into a different operational mode, like a massive theatre company preparing for opening night of the most important performance in imperial history. It begins with the servants. 3 days before a royal visit, the invisible women who maintain the harem's infrastructure begin working with an intensity that suggests their lives depend on achieving perfection. And their lives probably do depend on it, because imperfection in the presence of imperial majesty is not interpreted as human error, but as deliberate disrespect worthy of severe punishment. Every surface is cleaned until it reflects light like still water. Every textile is examined for stains, wear, or imperfections that might offend royal sensibilities. Every decorative element is adjusted to create precise aesthetic harmonies that demonstrate imperial wealth and artistic sophistication. The gardens are trimmed, the pools are drained and refilled, and the marble floors are polished until walking on them becomes a hazardous activity requiring careful attention to balance and momentum. But the real preparation involves transforming you and your fellow concubines into what the palace administrators call appropriate entertainment options. This process makes your daily beauty routine look like casual grooming for a trip to the market. You're about to receive the full imperial treatment, and imperial treatment is designed to create living artwork rather than enhance natural human beauty. The process begins with a medical examination that's more thorough than anything modern people experience during annual checkups. Palace physicians inspect every inch of your body for anything that might diminish your value as imperial entertainment. Skin conditions, dental problems, minor injuries, even calluses from musical instrument practice, everything is catalogued and addressed through treatments that range from helpful to horrifying. Your skin is treated with mixtures containing ingredients imported from across the known world. Ground pearls for luminosity, gold dust for radiance, rare oils for suppleness, and exotic perfumes for scent. The treatments burn, itch, and occasionally cause reactions that require additional treatments to address, but the results are undeniably impressive. You end up looking like you're made from some material more precious than ordinary human flesh. Your hair receives attention from specialists who treat coiffure like engineering projects, requiring mathematical precision. They create arrangements that incorporate literal architecture, small wire frameworks that support elaborate constructions of braids, curls, and decorative elements. By the time they're finished, your head carries sculptures that could be displayed in museums if museums existed, which they don't, because you're living in 500 BCE and art exists primarily to glorify imperial power. The clothing selection process involves considerations that make diplomatic negotiations seem straightforward. Palace administrators must balance several competing priorities, demonstrating imperial wealth through expensive fabrics and decorations, showcasing the diversity of the empire through different regional styles, creating visual harmony among multiple women who be seen together, and ensuring that individual concubines look appropriately beautiful without upstaging each other or suggesting that they consider themselves equal to royal status. You're assigned garments that cost more than most people's houses. Silk robes dyed with pigments, made from rare insects and precious metals, jewelry crafted by master artisans using techniques passed down through generations, and accessories that incorporate materials gathered from every corner of the Persian Empire. The weight of your outfit is substantial enough to affect your movement, and the complexity requires assistance from multiple servants to put on correctly. But the most intensive preparation involves what palace officials euphemistically call presentation training. This is where you learn to be decorative in the presence of the most powerful man on earth, and the training reveals just how artificial the whole imperial entertainment system really is. You practice entering rooms in formations that create pleasing visual arrangements from the royal perspective. You learn to position yourselves at specific distances from the throne that optimize the viewing experience for imperial eyes. You rehearse conversation techniques designed to provide entertainment without suggesting that you have independent thoughts or opinions about subjects beyond the immediate royal environment. Most importantly, you learn to be simultaneously present and invisible, to provide aesthetic pleasure and potential interaction opportunities, while never forgetting that you exist solely for imperial convenience. This requires mastering a psychological balancing act that would challenge professional actors, appearing interested without being intrusive, beautiful without being distracting, available without being presumptuous. The sexual education component is handled with the same systematic thoroughness that characterizes all palace training programs. You receive instruction in techniques designed to provide imperial pleasure while minimizing any inconvenience or discomfort for the King of Kings. The sessions are conducted by older women who approach the subject with the clinical detachment of medical professionals teaching surgical procedures. You learn positions that emphasize your decorative qualities while ensuring royal comfort. You practice expressions that suggest enthusiasm, regardless of your actual feelings. You master the art of being simultaneously passionate and submissive, eager and controlled, responsive and obedient. It's like learning to be a sexual automaton, programmed to provide specific responses to imperial inputs, while maintaining the convincing illusion of authentic human emotion. But here's what makes the whole preparation process particularly psychologically devastating: the knowledge that all this effort might be entirely wasted. Imperial visits to the women's quarters don't guarantee individual attention for anyone. The king might spend the entire evening discussing administrative matters with his advisors, while you and 50 other perfectly prepared concubines serve as human wallpaper in the background. Or he might select someone based on criteria that have nothing to do with the hours of preparation you've undergone. Maybe he'll choose the woman whose dress reminds him of his childhood, or someone who resembles a provincial governor's daughter he met during a military campaign, or simply whoever happens to be standing in the right place when he feels like having company. The arbitrariness of royal selection makes the intensive preparation feel simultaneously essential and meaningless. You have to assume you might be chosen, so you must prepare as if your life depends on achieving perfection. But you also know that perfection guarantees nothing, so all your effort might be completely irrelevant to the actual outcome. This creates a psychological state that modern people would recognize as learned helplessness, combined with performance anxiety. You're required to care deeply about results you can't control, while maintaining an appearance of serene confidence in a system that operates according to rules you can't understand or predict. The night of the imperial visit arrives with all the ceremony of a religious festival. The entire harem is assembled in the main reception hall, arranged in carefully planned formations that create visual harmony, while ensuring that every woman is theoretically available for royal selection. You stand in your assigned position, wearing clothing worth more than your family's annual income, decorated with enough precious materials to buy a small army, and prepared to provide entertainment that might never be requested. The King of Kings enters with an entourage that includes military advisors, administrative officials, and personal servants whose job is to ensure that imperial comfort is maintained regardless of circumstances. He's smaller than you expected. Most powerful men are. But he carries himself with the absolute confidence of someone who's never had to consider anyone else's opinion about anything. For the next 4 hours, you exist in a state of suspended animation. You're simultaneously hyper-alert and completely passive, ready to respond instantly to any imperial gesture while doing absolutely nothing unless specifically commanded. It's like being a piece of interactive furniture present, functional, and utterly dependent on external activation. The king spends most of the evening reviewing administrative documents, while servants provide food, wine, and musical background. Occasionally, he makes casual comments about palace aesthetics or requests minor adjustments to lighting or temperature. The concubines who happen to be nearby when these requests are made spring into action with the coordination of a well-trained military unit, making the requested changes while remaining as unobtrusive as possible. You watch this entire performance while maintaining the serene expression you've been taught to wear during royal presence. Your face shows appropriate reverence and availability, but your mind is cataloguing the reality of imperial entertainment. It's not about pleasure or companionship or even sexual gratification. It's about having unlimited access to human resources that can be deployed instantly to satisfy any momentary impulse. Around midnight, the king gestures toward Daria, a general concubine who's been in the harem for 6 years without previous royal recognition. Not because she's particularly beautiful this evening, or because she's demonstrated exceptional skills, but apparently because she's standing near a wine table when he decides he wants company while reviewing tribute reports from eastern provinces. Daria approaches with the graceful submission she's been practicing for years, and for the next hour, she sits beside the royal throne, reading correspondence aloud while the king makes notes and occasionally asks questions about pronunciation or meaning. It's not romantic, it's not sexual, and it's barely social. She's functioning as a human reading device with decorative qualities. But when the evening ends and the imperial entourage departs, Daria has been transformed. She's no longer a general concubine hoping for recognition. She's a woman who's provided personal service to the King of Kings. Her status jumps several levels, her living accommodations improve, and her future prospects change dramatically, all because she happened to be standing in the right place when imperial attention randomly fell in her direction. The rest of you return to your dormitories having spent 12 hours in intensive preparation and 4 hours in royal presence without receiving any individual recognition whatsoever. Technically, you've all been in the same room as the most powerful man on earth. Practically, you might as well have been decorative statues for all the personal interaction you experienced. But here's the truly insidious part. Despite recognizing the arbitrariness and fundamental meaninglessness of the entire process, you still feel disappointed that you weren't selected. Your rational mind understands that royal attention is random and that being chosen for administrative assistance isn't actually an honor. But your emotions have been so thoroughly conditioned by years of harem training that you experience genuine sadness at not being picked for what amounts to unpaid secretarial work. This is how totalitarian systems maintain psychological control, even over people who intellectually understand their manipulation. They create circumstances where your emotional responses contradict your rational analysis, making you complicit in your own subjugation even when you can clearly see how the subjugation operates. As you remove your elaborate costume and expensive decorations, returning them to palace storage until the next imperial visit, you realize you've just participated in an elaborate theatrical production where you played the role of a human prop, hoping to be upgraded to speaking part. And despite understanding exactly how degrading the whole experience was, you're already looking forward to the next performance. Because the alternative to hoping for arbitrary royal attention is accepting that you're going to spend the rest of your life as a human decoration in someone else's palace. And that alternative is psychologically unbearable, even when the hope itself is obviously irrational. Sweet dreams, imperial property. 5 years into your harem residency, you witness the fate that awaits women who fail to achieve permanent security through royal favor, and it's like watching your own future unfold in slow motion. Because in the Persian imperial system, aging isn't just a biological process, it's an economic catastrophe that transforms valuable assets into expensive liabilities. The lesson begins with Azadeh, who arrived at the palace 12 years ago as a 15-year-old beauty from a prominent family in media. She spent her first 5 years as a promising student, her next 4 years as a general concubine, receiving occasional royal attention, and her last 3 years watching her status slowly erode as newer, younger women claimed the imperial interest she once enjoyed. At 27, Azadeh is ancient by harem standards. Her beauty hasn't disappeared, exactly, but it's become the kind of mature attractiveness that appeals to men seeking wives, rather than the fresh, malleable appeal that captures royal attention. She's intelligent, educated, and possessed of social skills that would make her valuable in any normal marriage arrangement. But normal marriage arrangements aren't available to women who've been designated as imperial property. The palace's solution to the problem of aging concubines is characteristically systematic and utterly cold-blooded. Women who've aged out of sexual consideration but retain useful skills are transferred to administrative positions within the harem hierarchy. They become supervisors, instructors, or specialized servants, whose knowledge of palace systems makes them valuable for training and managing newer arrivals. This sounds like a reasonable retirement plan until you understand what it actually involves. Azadea now spends her days teaching deportment to 13-year-old girls who look at her with the particular mixture of pity and terror that young people reserve for glimpses of their own potential futures. She corrects their posture, refines their walking techniques, and prepares them for the same system of sexual availability and competitive desperation that she's now too old to participate in. Her living quarters have been downgraded from the comfortable accommodations provided to general concubines to a small room she shares with 3 other former concubines who've transitioned to administrative roles. Her clothing allowance has been reduced to simple, practical garments that emphasize her supervisory function rather than her decorative potential. Her daily schedule is filled with work rather than preparation for possible royal summons that will never come. But the most devastating aspect of her situation is the psychological adjustment required to accept that her years of waiting, hoping, and competing have led to a future that's essentially identical to the fate she was trying to avoid. She's become a palace servant whose specialized knowledge makes her slightly more valuable than the women who scrub floors. But she's still fundamentally a worker, maintaining the same system that failed to provide her with security or advancement. The cruel irony is that Azadea's intelligence and education qualities that should make her valuable actually make her situation more painful. She understands exactly what's happened to her, and exactly what's going to happen to the young women she's now training. She has to participate in perpetuating a system that destroyed her own prospects while maintaining an appearance of contentment with her reduced circumstances. During deportment lessons, she watches 13-year-old Yasmin practice the same graceful walking techniques she once mastered with equal dedication. She sees the same hopeful determination in Yasmin's eyes that she once felt, the same confidence that beauty and skill will somehow lead to security and recognition, and she has to encourage this hope, while knowing that statistics suggest Yasmin will end up in exactly the same position she now occupies. "Longer steps, dear," she says with the patient kindness expected from experienced instructors. "Remember, you're gliding rather than walking." The king appreciates grace above all other qualities. She's required to speak as if royal preference is predictable and royal attention is achievable through proper preparation, even though her own experience proves that neither assumption is true. The other former concubines have developed different coping strategies for their reduced circumstances. Roxana, who spent 8 years as a general concubine without achieving advancement, has embraced her role as a cosmetics instructor with apparent enthusiasm. She teaches makeup application techniques with genuine expertise, sharing knowledge she accumulated during years of desperate preparation for royal summons that rarely came. But if you watch carefully, you can see the moments when her professional facade slips and reveals the bitterness underneath. When a particularly promising student masters a complex eye painting technique, Roxana's congratulations are tinged with the resentment of someone who achieved the same skill level and received no reward for it. When students express excitement about upcoming imperial visits, her encouragement carries undertones of skepticism born from repeated disappointment. Farah, the eldest of the former concubines at 32, has been assigned to manage the harem's textile storage and distribution. She spends her days cataloguing silk robes, organizing jewelry collections, and maintaining the vast wardrobe required to keep 300 women appropriately dressed for their roles as imperial decorations. Her position gives her detailed knowledge of the economic resources devoted to maintaining the harem's aesthetic functions. "This single robe," she explains during a lesson on proper garment care, holding up a silk creation decorated with gold thread and precious stones, costs enough to feed a village for 6 months. The jewelry you wear during royal visits represents wealth that could build entire cities. His Magnificence's generosity in providing these resources demonstrates the value he places on your comfort and beauty. She delivers this information with the tone expected from palace instructors, but you detect the edge that suggests she's also thinking about how these resources could be used to provide genuine security for the women who wear them temporarily. A lifetime of handling valuable items that belong to other people has given her a different perspective on imperial generosity and its limitations. The most disturbing aspect of observing these older women is recognizing the subtle ways they've internalized the system's assessment of their reduced value. They speak more quietly than they used to, move with less confidence, and defer more readily to women whose only advantage is being younger. They've accepted the palace's judgment that their primary worth was their capacity to attract royal attention. And now that capacity has diminished, they must be content with whatever usefulness remains. But they've also developed survival strategies that aren't available to younger women, still competing for imperial favor. They've formed genuine friendships based on shared experience rather than competitive positioning. They can speak more honestly about palace realities because they're no longer protecting hope that might be damaged by too much truth. They've found ways to derive satisfaction from work that has actual value rather than depending entirely on external validation. When you observe their interactions during off-duty hours, you see glimpses of the women they might have been if they'd been allowed to develop naturally, rather than being processed through the imperial entertainment system. They're intelligent, funny, and possessed of hard-won wisdom about navigating complex social systems. In any normal society, they would be respected matriarchs with significant influence over family and community decisions. Instead, they're middle-aged women whose primary function is maintaining the machinery that will eventually process younger women in exactly the same way they were processed. They're simultaneously victims and perpetrators, survivors and enablers, women who've learnt to find meaning within a system designed to deny them meaningful lives. As you watch Azadi guide 13-year-old Yasmin through the same graceful movements she once practiced with equal hope, you're forced to confront the mathematical reality of your own situation. Unless you achieve the kind of imperial favor that leads to marriage or childbearing, outcomes that depend more on luck than merit, you're looking at your own future in 20 years. And the truly devastating realization is that even understanding this probable outcome doesn't change your behavior. You still participate in the beauty routines, still hope for royal summons, still compete with other women for attention that might never come. Because the alternative, accepting that you're probably going to end up teaching deportment to the next generation of imperial property, is psychologically impossible to embrace, while you still possess the youth that makes other outcomes theoretically possible. But every day that passes moves you one step closer to joining the women who smile patiently while training their own replacements. 6 years into your harem residency, you discover that even in the most controlled environment imaginable, human beings find ways to resist their circumstances. Though resistance in the Persian imperial harem takes forms that would be completely invisible to anyone not trained to recognize them, the rebellion begins with something as simple as bread. Palace regulations specify that meals should be consumed in communal dining areas under the supervision of appointed monitors, with conversation limited to approved topics and completion time to ensure efficient scheduling of daily activities. But Shahrazad, a general concubine who's been developing increasingly creative interpretations of palace rules, begins hiding small portions of bread in her clothing and consuming them privately in the garden during afternoon rest periods. This sounds like a trivial violation until you understand what it represents: unauthorized control over food consumption, unsupervised eating behavior, and the establishment of personal dietary choices independent of imperial meal planning. In a system designed to regulate every aspect of daily existence, choosing when and where to eat bread becomes an act of fundamental self-determination. The practice spreads through networks of trusted friends who share information about successful rule interpretation techniques. Not open rebellion, which would bring swift punishment, but careful testing of regulatory boundaries to identify areas where individual agency might be exercised without triggering administrative attention. Mariam discovers that bathhouse regulations specify minimum bathing duration, but don't explicitly forbid extending bathing time beyond the required minimum. She begins taking baths that last twice as long as necessary, using the extra time for private reflection in one of the few spaces where individual privacy is temporarily possible. The additional bathing time serves no practical purpose, but claiming it establishes her right to make personal scheduling decisions within the framework of official requirements. Gulshan develops a reading practice that technically complies with educational regulations while subverting their intended purpose. Palace rules require concubines to spend 2 hours daily reviewing approved literature, but the rules don't specify reading speed or comprehension methods. She begins reading the same poetry collections multiple times, analysing them for meanings that weren't intended by their authors, and developing personal interpretations that have nothing to do with imperial glorification. These individual acts of minor rebellion eventually evolve into more sophisticated resistance techniques that require coordination among multiple participants. The poetry readings become opportunities for coded discussion of forbidden topics, with classical verses serving as vehicles for expressing ideas that can't be stated directly. During a session focused on celebrating imperial military victories, the group discovers that ancient poems about conquest can be interpreted as commentaries on the psychology of power rather than simple celebration of Persian dominance. When the assigned text describes enemies bowing before imperial authority, the discussion focuses on the emotional experience of submission rather than the glory of victory. The poet's description of defeated peoples shows remarkable empathy for their psychological state, someone observes with the tone of academic analysis. His attention to their inner experience suggests deep understanding of how conquest affects the conquered. This sounds like literary criticism, but it's actually a discussion of their own emotional responses to imperial control, disguised as scholarly commentary. The conversation continues in this manner, allowing participants to explore forbidden territory while maintaining the appearance of appropriate educational activity. The musical instruction sessions become another venue for coded resistance. Traditional Persian compositions include complex rhythmic patterns that can be modified in subtle ways without changing the basic structure of the pieces. A drum beat that's supposed to emphasize imperial power can be played with slight variations that suggest uncertainty or questioning. A melody celebrating royal wisdom can be performed with ornamental additions that introduce notes of melancholy or ambiguity. These musical modifications are impossible to detect unless you're listening specifically for them, but they allow performers to express emotional content that contradicts the official message of the compositions. It's like singing protest songs that sound like praise music to anyone not familiar with the coded emotional language being employed. The most sophisticated resistance technique involves the strategic use of illness and injury to claim temporary exemption from activities that have become psychologically unbearable. Nothing dramatic enough to suggest deliberate self-harm, which would bring severe punishment, but minor ailments that require rest and reduced participation in regular programming. Daria masters the art of developing headaches that are severe enough to excuse her from beauty preparation sessions, but mild enough to avoid attracting medical attention that might reveal their psychosomatic nature. She's not malingering exactly, the headaches are real responses to stress, but she's learned to recognize and cultivate them as tools for creating temporary escape from overwhelming demands. Yasmin discovers that certain foods can produce digestive symptoms that require dietary modifications and schedule adjustments. Again, not deliberate poisoning, but strategic consumption of foods that her system doesn't handle well, timed to provide relief during particularly difficult periods. These illness-based resistance techniques require careful management to avoid detection by palace physicians who are trained to identify malingering behavior. The key is developing genuine symptoms through stress management techniques that produce real physical effects without causing permanent damage. But the most psychologically important form of resistance involves the development of secret personal identities that exist independently of imperial roles. In private moments during late-night conversations, in brief periods of solitude, in carefully constructed social situations that escape official monitoring, women begin to remember and cultivate aspects of themselves that have nothing to do with their function as imperial property. Parisa, who arrived from a family of merchants, begins teaching other women about trade negotiations and commercial mathematics during informal evening conversations. The knowledge serves no practical purpose in their current circumstances, but sharing it helps her maintain connection to her pre-harem identity while providing others with intellectual stimulation that has nothing to do with imperial entertainment. Roxana, whose family were skilled textile workers, demonstrates advanced weaving techniques using threads salvaged from garment repairs. She can't produce anything substantial without attracting attention, but the process of working with familiar materials helps her remember who she was before becoming palace property. These identity preservation techniques become communal activities that strengthen social bonds while maintaining psychological resistance to complete imperial assimilation. Women share stories about their families, teach each other skills from their previous lives, and create informal networks based on common background or interests rather than competitive positioning within palace hierarchies. The conversations during these resistance activities focus on topics that have been systematically excluded from official palace discourse. Memories of freedom, descriptions of normal human relationships, speculation about life outside imperial control, and dreams about hypothetical futures that don't involve competitive subjugation. Sometimes I remember what it felt like to walk outside without asking permission, someone might say during a late-night conversation in the dormitory. Just choosing a direction and walking until I felt like stopping. "I miss being hungry," another woman responds. "Not starving, but actually feeling hungry and then eating because I wanted food, not because it was time for scheduled meals." These conversations are incredibly dangerous because they focus on experiences that contradict the official narrative about imperial benevolence and palace privileges. But they're also psychologically essential for maintaining some connection to normal human experience and preventing complete mental capitulation to the imperial identity assigned to them. The resistance activities never challenge the fundamental structure of imperial control. The women involved understand that open rebellion would result in punishment that makes their current circumstances seem pleasant. But within the constraints of absolute powerlessness, they find ways to preserve fragments of individual agency and authentic human connection. And sometimes, late at night when the palace is quiet and the supervisors are asleep, they whisper stories about women who escaped, who found ways to leave the harem and return to normal life. These are probably myths, fantasies that provide psychological comfort rather than practical hope. But they tell the stories anyway, because even impossible dreams of freedom serve an important function in systems designed to make freedom unimaginable. 7 years into your harem residency, you understand that the physical design of the women's quarters isn't just about luxury or security. It's a carefully engineered system for maintaining psychological control through spatial manipulation that makes genuine human connection nearly impossible while creating the illusion of community. The layout seems straightforward at first glance. Dormitories for newer arrivals, private apartments for higher status women, communal areas for meals and education, gardens for exercise and relaxation, workshops for cultural training. It looks like a self-contained educational institution designed to provide comfort and enrichment for its residents. But after years of navigating these spaces, you begin to recognize the subtle ways the architecture shapes behavior and restricts the development of relationships that might threaten imperial control. Every room, corridor, and outdoor space has been designed to facilitate surveillance, while preventing the kind of private interaction that could lead to genuine solidarity among the residents. Take the dormitory arrangements. You're housed with 11 other women in a large room that provides adequate sleeping space for everyone, while ensuring that private conversation is virtually impossible. The sleeping mats are positioned close enough together that any whispered discussion can be overheard by multiple people, creating natural surveillance networks where everyone monitors everyone else out of simple proximity. But the spacing is also too close for comfort and too distant for intimacy. You can hear other women breathing, moving, and occasionally talking in their sleep, but you can't engage in the kind of extended personal conversation that builds genuine friendship. The architecture creates forced familiarity without actual closeness. You know intimate details about your roommate's sleep patterns and hygiene habits, but you may never have a private conversation with any of them. The communal dining area follows similar principles. Long tables accommodate large groups, while preventing the formation of small, exclusive social circles that might develop independent loyalties. You eat with different combinations of women each day, based on seating assignments that rotate regularly enough to prevent the development of consistent dining partnerships. The table design itself discourages intimate conversation. They're wide enough that speaking across them requires raising your voice to levels that make private discussion impossible, but narrow enough that sitting beside someone doesn't guarantee the opportunity for personal interaction. You end up eating in social situations that feel communal, but actually prevent genuine communication. The educational spaces are perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated in their design. Classrooms are sized to accommodate groups large enough that individual personalities get lost in collective dynamics, but small enough that everyone feels visible to instructors monitoring behavior and participation. The seating arrangements change regularly, preventing you from developing consistent study partnerships or academic relationships that might evolve into personal friendships. The workshop areas where you practice music, dance, and other cultural skills are designed with similar principles. Enough space for everyone to participate, but arranged in ways that make coordination and cooperation difficult. Musicians can't easily hear each other across the room. Dancers can't synchronize movements when they're positioned at distances that require visual rather than physical coordination. Individual practice is encouraged, but ensemble work becomes challenging enough that most women focus on developing solo skills rather than collaborative techniques. Even the gardens, which seem like spaces for relaxation and privacy, are carefully designed to prevent genuine solitude or intimate conversation. The paths wind in ways that ensure you're always visible from multiple directions. The seating areas are positioned to accommodate groups rather than pairs, and they're located where supervisors can monitor activity from administrative buildings. The few spaces that appear to offer privacy, small alcoves in corridors, quiet corners in common areas, secluded spots in the gardens, turn out to be surveillance points where conversations are most likely to be overheard by security personnel. You learn this through experience when casual comments made in apparently private locations result in administrative discussions about your attitude and social relationships. The bathing facilities demonstrate the most sophisticated understanding of privacy psychology. Individual bathing stalls provide the illusion of personal space while actually creating ideal conditions for eavesdropping on private conversations. The acoustics of the bathing areas amplify whispered discussions, making them audible to attendants whose official function is maintaining cleanliness, but whose practical role includes monitoring for inappropriate social bonding. But the most insidious aspect of the architectural control system is the way it shapes your mental map of possibility. After years of navigating spaces designed to prevent privacy, you stop looking for opportunities to have private conversations. After extended experience with seating arrangements that discourage intimate discussion, you stop attempting to form close personal relationships. The physical environment trains you to accept social isolation as natural rather than imposed. You develop movement patterns that conform to the architectural constraints without consciously recognizing that your behavior is being shaped by spatial design. You walk along designated paths, sit in assigned areas, and interact within approved social configurations, because those are the options the environment makes available. Alternative behaviors become literally unthinkable because the physical space doesn't support them. The genius of the system is that it makes isolation feel like personal choice rather than architectural manipulation. You don't feel like you're being prevented from developing close friendships. You feel like you're naturally inclined toward the kind of superficial social interaction that the space facilitates. You don't recognize that you're being surveilled. You feel like you're choosing to have conversations in public areas because private conversation doesn't seem necessary or appealing. This spatial conditioning becomes so complete that when opportunities for genuine privacy occasionally arise during brief periods when supervisors are distracted, or in moments when architectural surveillance breaks down, you don't know how to take advantage of them. You've been trained to interact within the constraints of constant visibility, and genuine privacy feels uncomfortable rather than liberating. The few women who recognize the architectural manipulation and attempt to circumvent it face significant challenges. Finding spaces for private conversation requires detailed knowledge of supervisor schedules, staff movement patterns, and the acoustic properties of different areas. Even then, the conversations must be brief enough to avoid detection and innocuous enough to deflect suspicion if partially overheard. Shahzad becomes expert at identifying moments when architectural surveillance is temporarily reduced. She knows which corners of the garden are briefly unmonitored during shift changes, which corridors offer acoustic privacy during specific time periods, and which communal areas can be used for private discussion if you understand the sight lines from administrative offices. But using this knowledge requires constant vigilance and careful timing that makes spontaneous friendship nearly impossible. You can't respond naturally to emotional moments or personal revelations if you're simultaneously monitoring for surveillance opportunities and calculating the risks of being overheard. The effort required to achieve privacy makes genuine intimacy extremely difficult, even when physical privacy is temporarily available. The result is a social environment where hundreds of women live in close proximity while remaining fundamentally isolated from each other. You know details about everyone's daily routines, personal habits, and superficial preferences, but you may not know anyone well enough to trust them with authentic emotional expression or honest political observations. This isolation serves multiple imperial purposes beyond simple security. Women who can't form genuine alliances are less likely to coordinate resistance activities. Women who don't develop deep emotional bonds are more likely to compete against each other for imperial attention. Women who lack authentic social support are more dependent on official sources of validation and encouragement. But perhaps most importantly, architectural isolation prevents the development of alternative social structures that might provide psychological refuge from imperial control. If you can't form genuine communities within the harem, you can't create shared meanings, collective identities, or informal support systems that exist independently of official palace hierarchies. As you move through these carefully designed spaces, practicing your assigned cultural skills and participating in monitored social activities, you realize you're living in a physical environment that's been engineered to prevent the development of the human connections that make psychological survival possible. And the most disturbing aspect is that the engineering is so sophisticated, you barely notice it's happening. 8 years into your harem residency, you've achieved mastery in the most complex theatrical art ever developed, performing perpetual gratitude for circumstances that are systematically destroying your capacity for authentic human emotion, while maintaining convincing enthusiasm for opportunities that exist primarily to demonstrate your powerlessness. This isn't simple acting. It's a form of psychological method performance that requires you to inhabit a character whose worldview contradicts everything your rational mind understands about your situation. You must become someone who genuinely appreciates imperial generosity, while simultaneously experiencing the daily reality of imperial control. The performance is so demanding that the line between acting and authentic feeling begins to blur in ways that fundamentally alter your personality. The gratitude performance begins each morning with expressions of appreciation for basic survival necessities that any normal person would consider rights rather than privileges. You thank the palace for providing food, shelter, clothing, and medical care services that are provided because maintaining your health serves imperial interests rather than because anyone cares about your well-being. But the expressions must sound spontaneous and heartfelt rather than formulaic. Palace administrators are trained to detect performative gratitude, and artificial appreciation is interpreted as potential disloyalty that requires additional supervision and attitude adjustment. You must find ways to sound genuinely thankful for receiving the minimum resources necessary to keep you alive and functional. This requires developing a psychological framework that transforms imperial control into imperial benevolence through mental gymnastics that would challenge professional philosophers. When palace regulations limit your movement to designated areas, you must reframe the restrictions as protective measures that ensure your safety and comfort. When administrative decisions remove choices about your daily activities, you must interpret the loss of autonomy as liberation from the burden of making difficult decisions. The reframing becomes particularly complex when dealing with policies that are obviously designed to benefit imperial interests rather than harem residents. When new regulations require additional beauty preparation time that reduces opportunities for rest and relaxation, you must express enthusiasm for the chance to enhance your appearance and demonstrate greater appreciation for imperial aesthetic standards. How wonderful that His Magnificence has provided additional time for us to properly honor His presence, you might say during discussions of schedule changes that actually make your life more difficult and restrictive. The comment must sound like genuine appreciation rather than sarcastic commentary, which requires mastering vocal tones and facial expressions that convey sincerity while your mind processes the actual implications of the policy change. The gratitude performance extends beyond verbal expressions to encompass behavioral demonstrations of appreciation that require sustained physical acting. You must move through your daily routine with the posture and energy of someone who feels privileged to participate in imperial entertainment rather than trapped in sexual servitude. Your walking should suggest eager anticipation rather than resigned compliance. Your participation in educational activities should demonstrate intellectual curiosity rather than mechanical fulfillment of requirements. During cultural training sessions, you must display enthusiasm for learning skills that exist solely to make you more effective imperial property. When practicing musical instruments, your body language should suggest genuine love of music rather than dutiful preparation for potential royal entertainment. When studying poetry, your expressions should indicate intellectual engagement with literature rather than memorization of propaganda designed to reinforce your subordinate status. The most challenging aspect of the gratitude performance involves expressing appreciation for the competitive dynamics that pit you against every other woman in the harem. You must somehow appear grateful for the opportunity to compete for imperial attention while simultaneously maintaining friendly relationships with the women you're competing against. This requires developing a complex social persona that celebrates competition while denying its psychological costs. When other women receive advantages you've been denied, better living assignments, improved clothing allowances, or increased access to cultural resources, you must respond with expressions of happiness for their good fortune, rather than natural feelings of envy or frustration. How deserving Yasmin is of her improved quarters, you might say, when learning that someone has been promoted to better accommodations after receiving royal attention. Her dedication to her studies has been truly inspiring. The comments must sound genuine enough to pass administrative scrutiny, while managing your own emotional responses to being passed over for similar recognition. The gratitude performance becomes particularly demanding during imperial visits, when you must maintain expressions of hopeful anticipation, despite understanding that royal selection is arbitrary and that being chosen often involves experiences that are more degrading than rewarding. You must appear eager for opportunities you don't actually want, while hiding disappointment about missed chances for experiences you rationally recognize as problematic. Standing in formation during royal entertainment sessions, you must radiate availability and enthusiasm while internally managing anxiety about the implications of potential selection. Your face must suggest that being chosen for imperial attention would fulfill your deepest desires, even though you understand that royal interaction involves temporary elevation, followed by return to previous status with additional pressure to be grateful for brief recognition. But here's where the gratitude performance becomes psychologically dangerous. After years of expressing artificial appreciation for imperial policies and opportunities, you begin to experience moments of genuine gratitude that contradict your rational understanding of your circumstances. The boundary between performed emotion and authentic feeling starts to erode as your brain adapts to the constant expression of positive responses to negative situations. You find yourself feeling actual appreciation when administrative policies provide minor improvements to daily life, even when the improvements are trivial compared to the fundamental problems they don't address. When palace officials announce slightly better food quality or marginally increased recreation time, you experience genuine relief and thankfulness, rather than recognition that these minor adjustments don't change your basic situation as imperial property. More disturbingly, you begin to feel authentic affection for supervisors and administrators who treat you with basic human decency, even though their kindness occurs within a system designed to deny your humanity. When Mandain provides gentle correction during poetry lessons rather than harsh criticism, you feel genuinely grateful for her approach, even though she's still participating in educational programs designed to make you more effective imperial property. This emotional confusion becomes most pronounced during interactions with palace physicians who provide medical care that maintains your health for imperial purposes. When they treat minor injuries or illnesses with competent attention, you experience real appreciation for their professional skill, even though you understand that they care about your well-being only insofar as it serves imperial interests. The gratitude performance eventually becomes so automatic that you stop recognizing it as performance. The expressions of appreciation, the demonstrations of enthusiasm, the behavioral displays of contentment become integrated into your personality in ways that make it difficult to distinguish between authentic responses and conditioned reactions developed for survival purposes. Late at night, when you're trying to process your actual feelings about daily experiences, you find yourself struggling to identify what you genuinely think and feel versus what you've been trained to think and feel. The woman who arrived at the palace 8 years ago with clear emotional responses to her circumstances has been replaced by someone whose feelings have been systematically restructured to align with imperial expectations. And the most terrifying realization is that this psychological transformation makes your life easier. Genuine gratitude for small pleasures is more comfortable than constant awareness of your fundamental powerlessness. Authentic appreciation for minor kindnesses feels better than persistent recognition of systematic exploitation. Sincere enthusiasm for available opportunities is less exhausting than maintained resistance to circumstances you can't change. You've learnt to love your chains because loving them hurts less than hating them, and because the performance of love has become so convincing that you can no longer tell the difference between acting and feeling. As you drift off to sleep, expressing silent gratitude for the comfortable sleeping mat and adequate blankets provided by imperial generosity, you wonder whether the woman who once ground grain in her family's courtyard would recognize the person you've become, and you're no longer sure you want to know the answer. 10 years into your residence in the Persian royal harem, you understand that you've been part of the most sophisticated system of human control ever devised, one that achieves complete domination not through obvious cruelty, but through the systematic application of luxury, hope, and the gradual erosion of your capacity to imagine alternative forms of existence. You are now 23 years old, which makes you a senior resident by harem standards. The 13-year-old girl who arrived in a covered wagon, weeping for her family and grinding grain, no longer exists except as a fading memory that sometimes surfaces during the quiet moments between sleep and waking. In her place stands a woman who can glide across marble floors with supernatural grace, speak in the melodious whispers that please imperial ears, and arrange her features into expressions of serene contentment that mask emotional complexities she herself no longer fully understands. Your daily routine has become as automatic as breathing. The 2-hour morning beautification process transforms you from a sleeping human being into a decorative object, suitable for imperial appreciation. You no longer think about the individual steps, the skin treatments, the elaborate hairstyling, the careful application of cosmetics that create artificial beauty according to imperial specifications. Your hands move through the procedures with practiced efficiency, while your mind processes the day's social dynamics and political calculations. The educational sessions that once seemed like genuine learning opportunities now reveal themselves as sophisticated programs for psychological conditioning disguised as cultural enrichment. You've memorized thousands of lines of poetry celebrating imperial wisdom, mastered musical pieces designed to create romantic atmosphere for royal entertainment, and perfected dance forms that emphasize your decorative rather than artistic capabilities. But more importantly, you've internalized the worldview. These activities were designed to instill the belief that your highest possible achievement is successful service to imperial pleasure. Your social relationships exist within carefully maintained boundaries that prevent genuine intimacy while creating the appearance of community. You know intimate details about the daily routines, personal habits, and surface-level preferences of hundreds of women, but you couldn't identify a single person you trust with authentic emotional vulnerability. The competitive dynamics built into harem society have made every potential friendship also a potential betrayal, every moment of personal connection also an opportunity for strategic manipulation. Most of the women who arrived with you have followed predictable trajectories. Some achieved brief periods of royal attention that elevated their status temporarily before imperial interest moved to newer arrivals. Others spent years in preparation for summons that never came and gradually transitioned to administrative roles within the harem hierarchy. A few managed to bear children who might be royal offspring, instantly transforming their positions, but also creating new pressures and uncertainties about their children's futures. Gulshan, who once sabotaged your training clothes and competed desperately for recognition, now manages textile distribution with the kind of rigid efficiency that former concubines develop when their dreams of advancement are replaced by the practical necessity of finding meaning within severely limited options. She speaks to current students with the mixture of kindness and barely concealed resentment that characterizes women who understand exactly what the younger women are hoping for, and exactly how unlikely those hopes are to be fulfilled. Parasa, who slept on the mat beside yours and served as an informal mood barometer for your dormitory, received 2 royal summons in her 6th year of residence. Both involved providing musical entertainment during administrative meetings, where her personal presence was less important than the ambient sound she created. The experience provided enough status elevation to secure her a private room and improved food rations, but not enough to fundamentally change her long-term prospects. She now spends her days teaching musical techniques to newer arrivals, while managing the psychological complexity of encouraging students to master skills that may never provide meaningful advancement. You've achieved a status that places you in the middle ranges of harem hierarchy, too senior to harbour realistic hopes of dramatic advancement, too young to accept gradual transition to purely administrative functions. You receive occasional royal summons, perhaps once every 18 months, that maintain your theoretical eligibility for higher status, while preventing the complete despair that affects women who are entirely ignored. The summons typically involve providing companionship during routine imperial activities, rather than intimate personal interaction, but they serve their psychological purpose of keeping hope alive at levels that prevent rebellion, while avoiding actual advancement. During your most recent royal audience, you spent 4 hours sitting silently beside the throne, while the king reviewed administrative correspondence from provincial governors. Your role was purely decorative, a living ornament that demonstrated imperial wealth while requiring no attention or interaction. You maintained perfect posture, appropriate facial expressions, and complete silence for the entire duration, then returned to your quarters feeling simultaneously honoured by the selection and emotionally empty from the experience. But here's what you've learnt about the true function of the harem system. It's not primarily about providing sexual entertainment for the king, though that's certainly one component. It's about demonstrating the empire's capacity to control the most fundamental aspects of human existence, to transform free people into willing slaves who genuinely believe their servitude represents privilege rather than oppression. The harem serves as a showcase for imperial power that's more impressive than military victories or architectural achievements. Any competent army can conquer territory, and any skilled engineer can build monuments. But transforming intelligent women into grateful participants in their own subjugation requires a level of sophistication that proves imperial superiority over basic human nature itself. Foreign ambassadors who visit the palace don't just see beautiful women, they see evidence that the Persian Empire possesses techniques for controlling human psychology that their own governments lack. The harem demonstrates that Persian authority extends beyond external compliance to internal transformation, that imperial power can reshape not just behavior but identity, desire, and fundamental self-concept. You've become living proof that systematic application of luxury, hope, and social pressure can make people complicit in systems that deny their humanity while genuinely appreciating the experience. You've learned to find satisfaction in achieving excellence at activities designed to reduce you to an object, to feel pride in mastering skills that exist solely to make you more effective imperial property, to experience gratitude for opportunities that normal people would recognize as degradation. The most sophisticated aspect of your psychological conditioning is that it's made you aware of your own conditioning without providing any practical alternatives to acceptance. You understand exactly how the harem system operates, recognize the techniques being used to control your behavior and emotions, and can analyze the political and economic functions you serve within imperial power structures. But this awareness exists alongside emotional responses that have been shaped by years of systematic conditioning to align with imperial objectives. You know rationally that your beauty routines are designed to transform you into a decorative object, but you still feel genuine satisfaction when they're successful. You understand intellectually that your cultural education exists to make you more effective imperial property, but you still experience authentic pleasure when you master new skills. You recognize analytically that your social relationships are structured to prevent genuine solidarity, but you still feel real affection for other women, despite the competitive dynamics that separate you. This combination of intellectual awareness and emotional compliance represents the ultimate achievement of totalitarian psychology. You've been trained to understand your own oppression while being unable to respond to that understanding with effective resistance. The system has made you conscious of your chains while ensuring that consciousness serves imperial interests rather than liberation. But perhaps the most devastating realization is that the alternatives to your current situation are largely theoretical rather than practical. Even if the harem system were to disappear tomorrow, you lack the skills, connections, and psychological foundation necessary for independent survival in normal society. 10 years of imperial conditioning have made you dependent on the very system that exploits you, unable to function in environments that require autonomous decision-making and self-directed behavior. You've been so thoroughly adapted to life as imperial property that freedom would require rehabilitation as extensive as your original conditioning. And rehabilitation would involve giving up the genuine pleasures and satisfactions you've learnt to find within the constraints of harem life. The aesthetic appreciation, the cultural sophistication, the social connections that exist despite their competitive limitations. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, you imagine what might have happened if you'd never been selected for the harem. You picture a parallel version of yourself who married a craftsman from your village, bore children who belonged to you rather than the state, and lived a life of ordinary struggle and ordinary satisfaction. But that imagined alternative feels less real than your current existence, like a story about someone else rather than a path you might have taken. The woman who grinds grain in your imagination is a stranger whose problems finding enough food, maintaining family relationships, navigating village politics, seem simultaneously simpler and more overwhelming than the complexities of imperial life. You've lost the capacity to desire normal human existence because normal human existence has become literally unimaginable. As you settle onto your sleeping mat, surrounded by the quiet breathing of women who've undergone the same psychological transformation, you realize you've participated in the creation of your own prison. Every day you've complied with harem regulations. You've reinforced the system that keeps you trapped. Every moment you've felt genuine gratitude for imperial generosity. You've validated the techniques being used to control you. Every time you've competed successfully against other women for minor advantages, you've strengthened the competitive dynamics that prevent solidarity. You've become simultaneously the victim and the perpetrator, the prisoner and the guard, the oppressed and the accomplice. And the most terrifying part is that this transformation feels like personal growth rather than systematic destruction. You've learnt to experience your own annihilation as achievement. The stars visible through the small windows of your quarters are the same stars that shone on the village where you once lived freely. But they illuminate a person who shares only your physical body with that long-lost girl. She died years ago, replaced by someone who finds meaning in meaninglessness, satisfaction in subjugation, and beauty in her own carefully constructed chains. And tomorrow, you'll wake up grateful for another day of the same. The King of Kings sleeps in his chambers, surrounded by evidence of his dominion over the known world. But his greatest conquest isn't the territory he controls or the armies he commands. It's the women who've learnt to love their captivity, to compete for the privilege of serving his pleasure, and to find their deepest satisfaction in the perfect performance of their own subjugation. Sweet dreams, imperial masterpiece. Sweet dreams. That's it for tonight's journey into the perfumed prisons of ancient Persia, where being chosen for the royal harem meant entering a golden cage that transformed free women into willing ornaments for imperial power. If you enjoyed this deep dive into historical psychological warfare disguised as luxury, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what other aspects of ancient life you'd like me to explore. Remember, the past is full of stories that make our current problems seem both more and less significant by comparison. Sometimes the best way to understand our own time is to see how differently human beings have lived, loved and suffered throughout history. Thanks for spending your sleepless hours with me, and I'll see you next time for another descent into the fascinating misery of historical existence. Sleep well if you can.